Chapter 1. It begins not with a man, nor with a thought, but with the light. The light as it falls late in the day, slant and gentle, through the silvered leaves of the olive grove. It is a light the color of warm honey stirred with a spoon, thick and slow-moving, pooling on the packed earth in soft ovular shapes. It catches the dust motes kicked up by a passing breeze and turns them into a brief, glittering cosmos, each one a tiny, floating sun. The shadows cast by the ancient trees are long and soft-edged, the color of a deep bruise on a plum, stretching across the path like sleeping beasts. Here, on the low hills outside Athens, the air itself has a texture. It is thick with the scent of the sun-baked dust, a scent as old as stone. Woven through it is the sharp medicinal fragrance of wild thyme crushed underfoot, and fainter, carried on an inconsistent current from the south, the clean, briny promise of the Saronic Gulf. It is a place of immense quiet, not of silence, but of a peace stitched together from the drone of a late bee and the rustle of a lizard in the dry grasses. A rhythm not of human making, but of the earth's own slow, turning breath. Into this quiet tableau walks a man. He is defined first by his movement, a slow and deliberate shuffle that seems less a journey towards a destination and more an act of settling into the world. His sandals, worn to the shape of his feet, make a soft, rhythmic shush-shush on the path. His chiton is of simple, undyed linen, softened by countless washings until it drapes his frame with the gentle familiarity of a second skin. His face, when he lifts it to the failing light, is a map of a long life lived in thought. The lines are etched deep around his eyes and mouth, but they are not the furrows of anxiety or bitterness. They are the riverbeds of contemplation, carved by the patient flow of quiet observation. He pauses beneath the gnarled branches of the largest olive, a tree so old its trunk has twisted into a braid of wood and air. He closes his eyes. For a moment the grove vanishes, and he is back in the agora. The memory is an assault of sound, the sharp clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the high-pitched bickering of vendors, and above it all, the relentless tide of voices. Voices raised in argument, sharp with certainty, thick with rhetoric. The clash of philosophies, the clangor of men trying to hammer the world into a shape that would fit their words. He can still feel the echo of it in his bones, a weariness that has nothing to do with his body and everything to do with his soul. He feels the immense, crushing weight of all those words, piled one on top of the other, forming a tower from which no one could truly see the sky. He had spoken too, his own voice adding to the din, and now he feels a profound longing for a truth that does not need to be shouted, a wisdom that does not need to be defended against its opposite, a truth that simply it is, like the rough bark of the olive tree against which he now rests a hand. A younger man walks a few paces behind him, his energy a stark contrast to the elder's calm. This is Elian, his student, his face still bright with the heat of the day's debates. His brow is furrowed, not with worry, but with the intense effort of intellectual pursuit. He reveres the man before him, sees in his quietude the very peak of the mountain he himself is so desperately trying to scale. "Theron," he begins, his voice earnest, breaking the grove's spell. "When Protagoras claims that man is the measure of all things, he suggests a justice that is relative, shifting with the wind of opinion. But if virtue is knowledge, as you have said, then surely justice must be a fixed star, a form unchanging. Elian's words are carefully chosen, a net of logic he is casting to capture a great truth. He is ready for the counter-argument, the Socratic dissection that will lead him closer to understanding. But the old philosopher does not turn to face him. He does not offer a rebuttal. Instead, he slowly raises a hand, the gesture not one of dismissal, but of quiet invitation. He lets it hang in the honeyed air for a moment, a silent plea for a different kind of attention. Then he points downward. His finger indicates a spot on the path near the base of the tree. There, a disciplined column of ants marches with meticulous purpose. A few of them are struggling together, their tiny bodies straining as they haul a single fallen fig seed, a treasure of immense proportions, back toward the dark, unseen architecture of their home. They move as one, a singular intelligence distributed amongst 100 tiny bodies. There is no debate, no hesitation. There is only the task, the path, the collective will. Elian's words falter and then cease. He follows his teacher's gaze, his mind, still racing with abstract concepts of the good and the just, slowly coming to a halt. He watches the small, determined creatures. He watches the intent focus of his teacher. The two of them stand in a shared, expanding silence. The philosopher and the student, their grand ideas momentarily humbled by this miniature epic unfolding in the dust. The sun dips lower, a final brilliant sliver of orange on the horizon, and the light deepens, turning the dust motes from gold to smoldering embers. The air grows cooler, carrying the first scent of night-damp earth. From the tall grasses, a single cricket begins its hesitant, soaring song, a prelude to the coming chorus of the dark. Theron finally lowers his hand. His gaze remains on the ants, who have now almost reached the entrance to their colony. He speaks, his voice so quiet it seems less a sound and more a part of the evening air itself, a thought given just enough breath to exist. They do not argue about their purpose, he says, as much to himself as to the boy beside him. They simply live it. Chapter 2. The city did not so much end as fray at the edges, its grand pronouncements of marble and argument unraveling into dusty lanes and the weary silence of sun-baked clay. The clamor of the agora, that great human sea of shouted prices and fever-pitched dialectic, receded behind them, a tide pulling out. At first its echo clung to them, a ringing in the ears, a phantom vibration in the bones. But with each step, Lycomedes and his young apprentice, Cleon, took upon the path that wound toward the low, sleeping hills, the city's hold grew weaker. The sound was replaced by another, more ancient language, the soft percussion of their sandals on the gravel-strewn earth, a sound like dry seeds shaken in a gourd, and then the first hesitant stitch of a cricket's song, sewing up the torn fabric of the day. Cleon, his mind still a gymnasium of competing thoughts, felt the silence not as a relief, but as a vacuum demanding to be filled. The afternoon's debates had left him wired and restless, his spirit buzzing like a trapped bee. He drew a breath, the air already cooler, smelling of time crushed underfoot. But the sophist's argument, master, he began, his voice a little too loud in the quiet. If virtue is merely a craft, a technique, to be learned, then is its teacher not just a craftsman and the soul merely his raw material? It reduces all of morality to a set of instructions no different from building a wall or shaping a pot. Where then is the divine spark, the intrinsic good? Lycomedes walked on for a dozen more paces, his posture one of deep listening, not just to Cleon, but to the world itself. The weight of his years seemed settled not in his shoulders, but in his feet, as if he drew some quiet strength from the ground with every step. Cleon, expecting a swift counter-argument, a precise dismantling of the sophist's premise, found himself walking into a wall of profound and patient silence. Then the old philosopher stopped. His movement was so gentle it was less a cessation of motion and more a settling, like dust coming to rest in a sunbeam. He did not turn to face the grand sweep of the valley below or the distant wine-dark sea. His hand, weathered and mapped with the fine lines of a long life, rose slowly, a gesture of quiet reverence. His finger pointed not at the horizon but down, towards the humble foliage of an olive tree that grew beside the path. He indicated a single leaf. Cleon, his torrent of words dammed, followed the old man's gaze. He saw it, a small silver-green spearhead of a leaf, ordinary in every way. And yet, as he truly looked, commanded by the silent gravity of his master's attention, the world narrowed to this one perfect object, a final honeyed shaft of sun escaping from behind the shoulder of the hill, struck it not with force but with a painter's caress. The light gilded the edge, turning the soft down upon its surface into a halo of pale fire. It illuminated the fine silt that had settled upon it, each grain a mote of gold. The central vein was a raised spine of darker green, and from it smaller veins branched out like the delicate calligraphy of a forgotten language, a map of the leaf's own quiet existence. Beneath it, its own shadow lay upon the leaf below, a shape of deep, cool violet, a respite from the day's last blaze. There was no lecture, no moral, no syllogism. There was only the leaf, held in the amber of the evening light. Cleon felt the intricate architecture of his arguments begin to soften, the sharp corners of his logic blurring. He had been trying to capture the world in a net of words. Lycomedes was showing him it was better to simply watch it alight on his hand. They resumed their walk. The pace was slower now, imbued with a shared and unspoken deliberation. The sun had fully slipped away, and the world was rendered in deepening shades of grey and bruised purple. A few moments later, Lycomedes paused again. This time, he crouched, his old knees bending with a soft crackle. He looked intently at the gnarled root of an ancient pine, a mountain range in miniature that buckled the earth of the path. Following his master's gaze, Cleon saw them, a line of ants, a river of dark, shimmering purpose, flowing over the rugged terrain. They navigated a chasm of cracked bark, hoisted infinitesimal burdens, their antennae twitching with a silent communal dialogue. One ant, struggling with a pine needle many times its length, was momentarily aided by two others, the three of them a fleeting tableau of unthinking industry. There was no glory in their work, no philosophy, only an immense and relentless persistence. Cleon, who moments before had been wrestling with the grandest concepts of the human soul, found himself captivated by this miniature drama. He crouched beside Lycomedes, the dust of the path staining the knees of his chiton. The frantic energy in his chest began to subside, replaced by a soft, engaged wonder. The silence between the two men was no longer a vacuum, but a vessel filled with the shared experience of seeing. The great questions of virtue and truth seemed impossibly loud and abstract compared to the tangible, undeniable reality of this ant, this root, this gathering dusk. His mind, for the first time since sunrise, grew quiet. They stood, and in the sky above, now a deep and cloudless lavender, the first star pricked the veil. It shone with a pure, cold light, a single point of certainty in the vast twilight. It was only then that Lycomede spoke. His voice, when it came, was not the sound of a teacher correcting a student, but of a man sharing a confidence with the evening itself. It was as soft as the cool air that now drifted down from the hills. "The world offers its own arguments, Cleon," he murmured, his gaze still fixed on that first star. "They are not spoken in words, but in light and shadow and the effort of the smallest creatures." He said nothing more. They stood together as the darkness deepened around them, the cricket's song swelling into a gentle chorus. The air was thick with the scent of pine and cooling stone, and the vast, silent eloquence of the night. The first true lesson had been given, not in a hall of echoing stone, but here, under the patient gaze of a single nascent star. Chapter 3. He left the scent of wet earth and failure behind him, the ghost of the cracked crater cooling on the wheel. The sounds of Athens, once a comfort, now grated like sand in a bearing. The clang of a distant smith, the high-pitched calls of merchants packing their stalls, the rumble of cartwheels on stone. They were the sounds of a life he knew so well it had become invisible, a rhythm he had forgotten how to hear. His feet, clad in worn leather, carried him past the last of the whitewashed walls, their surfaces glowing a soft, bruised rose in the late afternoon sun. He walked not with purpose, but with an absence of it, drawn by a quiet pull towards the rising slope where the olive groves began. The air changed first. It shed the city's heat and dust, thinning into something cooler, scented with sun-baked pine and the sharp, clean fragrance of wild thyme crushed underfoot. The path was no more than a suggestion, a faint track worn into the ochre soil by generations of goatherds, and, more recently, by the solitary wanderings of the old philosopher. With each step, the city's hum receded, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a presence. It was a silence woven from the drone of a late bee, the sigh of wind through dry grass, and the immense patient stillness of the trees ahead. He entered the grove as one might enter a temple. The world dissolved into a soft, subaqueous light, filtered through a canopy of silver-green leaves. It was a painter's light, thick and alive, falling in slanted columns that illuminated dust motes in their slow, hypnotic dance. Shadows lay deep and cool, the color of a bruised plum, pooling around the trunks of the ancient trees, and there, a short way into the arboreal twilight, stood Praxetus. The potter stopped. He had seen the old man from his window countless times, a distant figure moving with a serene and measured pace. But up close he was something else entirely. He was not lecturing an unseen student or lost in some grand internal dialogue. He was simply standing, his back to the path, one hand resting flat against the gnarled, fissured bark of an olive tree so old it seemed less a plant and more a feature of the earth itself. The gesture was not one of possession or even of study, it was one of listening, as if he were discerning a slow, deep pulse within the wood. As if feeling Lycomedes' gaze, Praxitas turned. His face, a landscape of fine lines carved by sun and thought, held no surprise, no question. His eyes, clear and deep-set, held a kindness that was not effusive but elemental, like the shade of a great rock. He did not ask what sorrow or frustration had driven the potter from his workshop. He did not ask why he had come. He simply looked at Lycomedes, and in that look there was a complete and gentle acceptance. A moment passed, suspended in the golden air. Then the philosopher's voice, quiet and textured as the bark beneath his hand, broke the stillness. "The light is good this evening." It was not a greeting, but a shared observation, an offering. He withdrew his hand from the tree and made a small, unassuming gesture, an opening of the palm, that was a clear invitation to walk with him. Lycomedes gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod and fell into step beside him. They walked without a word, two figures moving through the shifting mosaic of light and shade. For the potter, the silence was a balm. The tight knot of failure in his chest did not vanish, but it began to loosen its grip, its sharp edges softened by the profound peace of the grove. He had spent a lifetime imposing his will upon the world, wrestling clay into shape, firing it into permanence. Here, there was nothing to shape, nothing to conquer. There was only being. Praxitas stopped, his gaze directed at the ground. Lycomedes followed his line of sight to a small grey stone, warmed by the last of the sun. Climbing its miniature face was a beetle, its shell a miracle of iridescence, a tiny universe of shifting violet, green and bronze, like oil spilled on dark water. It moved with a slow, determined patience, its delicate legs finding purchase on the rough surface. Lycomedes watched, captivated, until it crested the stone and disappeared into a clump of moss. He had not noticed such a small, perfect thing in years. They walked on. The philosopher paused again, this time to point a single steady finger towards a low-hanging olive branch. He said nothing, but his gesture guided Lycomedes' eyes to a single leaf, turned just so against the fading sky. The setting sun caught its underside, illuminating the fine, downy hairs, until the whole leaf glowed from within, a soft, silver-white fire against the deepening blue. It was a beauty so fleeting, so exquisitely particular, that it pierced the potter's melancholy like a sliver of light. The world was breathing around him. He could feel it now. The questions that had haunted his workshop, the weight of years, the fear of stagnation, the cracked vessel that mirrored a cracked spirit, they were still there, but they had lost their voice. They were drowned out by the rustle of leaves, the scent of the cooling earth, and then a new sound, the first tentative chirp of a cricket, a single clear note testing the air. Another answered from the shadows. Soon, a quiet chorus was rising, stitching the twilight together with invisible thread. Lycomedes drew a slow, deep breath. His hands, which had felt so heavy and useless all day, now felt only the cool evening air against his skin. He was not thinking of the life he had, or the life he might have wanted. He was not, for the first time in a very long time, thinking at all. He was simply seeing. And in the quiet company of the old man under the ancient listening trees, that was enough. Chapter 4. The hour was old gold, poured thick and slow across the hills. They walked deeper into the olive grove than she had ever been, to where the path dissolved into a memory of itself, a mere suggestion pressed into the earth by the passing of seasons rather than the feet of men. Here, the air grew still, heavy with the day's accumulated warmth. It held the scent of baked dust, of wild thyme crushed underfoot, of the resinous, peppery breath of the olive trees themselves. A scent of permanence. For a long time, there was only the sound of their soft-soled sandals whispering against the dirt and the rising percussive thrum of the crickets, tuning their 1,000 tiny instruments for the coming night. In the first weeks of these walks, Ilara had filled such silences with a nervous interior chatter, a frantic assembly of questions she thought a student ought to ask. She had waited for Kaize to begin, to profess, to unravel some knot of philosophy. But that urgency had long since bled out of her, draining into the patient's soil. Now she understood. The waiting was not for a lecture, it was for the world itself to speak, in its own unhurried tongue. She learned not to listen for a lesson, but to let the lesson find her. He stopped, as she knew he would, not with any suddenness, but with a slow drawing to a halt, as if his feet were finding their own roots. He stood before an olive tree of immense age, a being that seemed more mineral than plant. Its trunk was a landscape of its own, a gnarled, tormented sculpture of wood split by lightning, hollowed by time, and twisted into a posture of profound endurance. Kaize did not speak. He simply raised a hand, his long, age-spotted fingers tracing the contours of the bark. It was not a touch of assessment, but of reverence, a greeting between old friends. His gaze, and then his gesture, guided her. He did not point to the magnificent ruin of the trunk, or to the silver-gray canopy that shimmered against the deepening blue of the sky. He directed her eye to a single, perfect detail. One leaf. It was just one leaf among thousands, but a final, defiant shaft of sunlight had found it, setting it ablaze. It was no longer green, but a sliver of molten silver, incandescent. Kaize traced the light's journey with a slow finger, not touching, but honoring its path. He followed it from the burning leaf, down the delicate stem to the branch, along the muscular limb to the deeply grooved trunk, and down into the profound shadow where the roots, unseen, held their deep and patient grip on the earth. The light was not merely falling upon the tree, it was telling its story. It was a narrative written in photons, a slow, deliberate brushstroke that revealed a history of resilience. It spoke of long, parched summers and violent winter storms, of the slow, infinitesimal thickening of bark, of the patient, determined growth toward a distant sun. In that single, illuminated leaf, Ilara saw the tree's entire life, a testament not to victory, but to the quiet, unyielding act of remaining. As the sun sank below the ridgeline, that last beam of light was extinguished, and the world seemed to take a breath. The color bled from the scene, leaving behind shapes and shadows. It was then, in the dimming, that the other senses awoke. Kaize closed his eyes, his face tilted slightly upward, as if to better receive the evening air. It was a gentle invitation. Ilara did the same. The world, stripped of its visual clamor, rearranged itself into a symphony of the small. The agora is loud with men arguing over what is true, Lycomedes whispered, his voice so soft it was almost part of the rustling leaves. But listen here. What truth does the cricket know? What wisdom does the wind share with the leaves? It was not a riddle to be solved, it was a key. Elara let go and listened. At first it was just a wall of sound, the singular pulsing rhythm of the crickets. But then, as her mind grew quiet, the layers began to separate. She could hear the distinct, rhythmic chirr of one insect nearby, and the answering chorus from across the grove. Beneath that, a softer sound, the dry, papery rustle of a lizard slipping through the fallen leaves. Farther away, so faint it was almost a feeling, the gentle, bleating call of a goat from a distant farmstead. She felt the air move against her skin, and she could hear its passage through the silver canopy, a sound like a slow exhalation. And under it all, another rhythm, closer than any of the others, the soft, steady drum of her own blood in her ears. Her heartbeat, which had so often raced with anxiety in the city, seemed to be slowing, finding the ancient, unhurried cadence of the grove. The truth of the cricket was its song. The wisdom of the wind was its movement. There was nothing more to know. When they finally turned to go, the last of the sun's color had drained from the sky, leaving a deep, bruised purple in its wake. The first stars pricked the darkness, faint as scattered salt, then brighter, colder, impossibly distant. The lights of the town flickered far below them, a small human constellation against the immense dark. The lesson was over, but nothing felt concluded. That was the mystery of it. Nothing had been solved or conquered. Instead, something had been opened. A space had been cleared inside her, a quiet room where the anxious need to know had been replaced by the gentle, fulfilling act of a noticing. The world was no longer a problem to be solved, a text to be mastered. It was a presence to be met, to be shared, to be witnessed in its own unfolding. They walked back in a silence that was different now, not an absence of words, but a fullness of understanding. It was a silence that held the light on the leaf, the song of the cricket, and the shared steady rhythm of their breathing in the cool, star-dusted dark. Chapter 5. The sun had begun its slow, magnanimous bleed into the western hills, and the light that fell upon the world was no longer the sharp, interrogating glare of noon, but something thicker, something you could almost feel on your skin. It was the color of honey held up to a candle, and it drenched the olive grove, pooling in the hollows and gilding the dust that rose in soft puffs from their sandals. Lycomedes walked, and for the first time in a lifetime of walking, he felt the act in its entirety. He felt the soft give of the earth, the slight chafe of leather against his heel, the warm air moving like a sigh through the fine hairs on his arms. Beside him, the boy Theo walked with the easy grace of a creature who had never known a world disconnected from his own body. For years, a walk had been merely a vessel for thought, a peripatetic engine for the mind's churning. But today, the engine had stilled. The thoughts, those clamoring birds that had for so long filled the cage of his skull, were quiet. There was only the sound of their scuffing sandals on the path and the drowsy evening hum of insects in the wild thyme that grew in stubborn clumps between the stones. The light, That thick, golden light caught the silvered undersides of the olive leaves as a breeze shivered through the branches, and, for a moment, the whole grove was alive with 1,000 tiny flashes, like a net of fish being hauled from a dark sea. The shadows of the gnarled ancient trunks stretched long and skeletal, fingers of deep, cool blue laid across the warm ochre of the path. He was watching one such shimmer of silver when a single leaf, perfect in its slender ellipse, detached from its twig. It did not simply fall. It descended in a slow, deliberate spiral, turning in the syrupy air as if performing a final quiet dance for the dying sun. It drifted, and Lycomedes, without thinking, opened his hand. The leaf came to rest in his palm, a feather-light touch, a small green boat on the sea of his skin. He stopped. Theo, sensing the halt, stopped with him, his gaze following not his master's, but that of a lizard skittering over a sun-warmed rock nearby. Lycomedes looked at the leaf. He did not think of its phylum or its function, nor did he begin to construct a metaphor for its journey. He simply looked. With the pad of his thumb, he traced the delicate prominence of its central vein, a fine raised line like a scar of life. He felt its smooth, waxy surface cool against his own warmth. The fading sunlight poured into it, passing through its cells, transforming its simple green into a luminous, sacred emerald. It was a jewel made of earth and light. He thought of the thousands of dialogues he had orchestrated, the soaring architecture of arguments spun from the thinnest air of logic, and a profound emptiness echoed within him. None of it, not the most elegant proof or the most unassailable conclusion, had ever felt as real, as undeniably and true as the weightless fact of this leaf in his hand. He lifted his gaze from the leaf and turned to the boy. Theo's eyes, clear and untroubled, were still on the world, watching the way the light softened the edges of the stones. They were eyes that saw things as they were, not as they might be interpreted. "Tell me, Theo," Lycomedes said, and his voice was not the resonant timbre of the teacher, but something quieter, frayed at the edges. "What is the work of this tree?" He gestured with his chin towards the ancient olive they stood beside, its trunk a twisted testament to a century of sun and wind. Theo, accustomed to questions of virtue and the nature of the soul, blinked. He looked at the tree, his head tilted. He did not look at the clusters of green, nascent olives, nor did he seem to consider the oil they would one day produce. His gaze fell instead to the ground, to a patch of deep, soft shade the branches cast upon the warm earth. "To offer rest," he said, his voice as simple and unadorned as his observation. He then looked up into the canopy where the last of the golden light was caught and held. "And to hold the light." The words did not land as a clever answer or a challenge. They landed like a key turning in a lock that Lycomedes had forgotten was even there, a lock deep in the chambers of his being, rusted shut by years of abstraction. And to offer rest, to hold the light. And he looked at the olive trunk, at its muscular, patient contortions, a living sculpture carved by time and weather. It did not strive or argue, it simply was. It endured, and in its being it gave. He understood then, in a silent, shimmering wave of knowing that washed through him. Wisdom was not a fortress to be besieged by the battalions of the intellect. It was not a prize to be wrestled from the heavens. It was shade, It was sunlight. It was a thing to be received. He had spent his life studying the geometry of the cup, the philosophy of thirst, the idea of water, but he had forgotten, or perhaps had never learned, how to simply lower his head to the spring and drink. A tension that had coiled for decades in his shoulders, a rigid armature of thought and proof, finally began to unspool. He felt the thinker and the feeler, two strangers who had inhabited the same body, turn and recognize one another at last. The last sliver of the sun's disk slid behind the horizon, and the air cooled at once. The gold drained from the sky, leaving behind a wash of deepening violet and the softest blush of rose along the serrated edge of the mountains. A profound and settled peace fell over the grove, a quiet that was not an absence of sound but a presence in itself. Lycomedes reached out and placed his palm flat against the rough, fissured bark of the tree. He could feel the last of the day's warmth radiating out, a slow, steady pulse of stored sun. It felt less like touching an object and more like a handshake, a greeting with an old and patient friend. His philosophy, he knew now, could not live only in the rarefied air of the academy. It had to be rooted here, in this soil, in the quiet kindness of shade, in the simple, sacred act of seeing a leaf fall. The walk was ending, the day was done, and he had not found the grand answer he had always sought. But he was left with a much better question. Not, what is truth? But rather, where can truth be felt? Chapter 6. The last of the day's heat had long since surrendered its hold on the world, leaving behind a cool breath that swept up from the valley floor. Lycomedes sat alone on the stone veranda, the cool of the slabs a solid presence felt even through the thin wool of his chiton. Before him, the olive grove was no longer a collection of individual trees, but a single breathing entity, a sea of deepest indigo and soft moving blacks, pooled beneath a vast and silent canopy of stars. He had watched them prick the velvet dome of the sky one by one, those distant, silent fires, as familiar to him as the lines on his own hand. A single oil lamp rested on the low stone wall beside him. Its flame was a small, steady tear of gold, unwavering in the still air. It cast a gentle, living light upon his face, a wash of warm ochre that softened the deep-hewn canyons of his brow and the thoughtful set of his mouth. In that flickering glow, the dust motes, disturbed by some forgotten stir of air, danced like tiny, fleeting constellations, a universe in miniature. The air itself was a tapestry of scents, thick with the dry, honest smell of the earth and the memory of the sun-baked dust, threaded through with the sudden, sweet intrusion of night-blooming jasmine from the garden below, a fragrance that spoke only of darkness and secrets. In his hands, he cradled a simple clay cup, its surface unglazed and cool against his palms. He had filled it with water from the well, and now he watched the starlight, fractured and impossibly distant, shimmer upon its dark, still surface. He tilted the cup, and the light slid like quicksilver. For a lifetime, his mind had been an agora, a bustling marketplace of shouting voices, Platonists and sophists, cynics and stoics, all vying for his attention, each peddling a different version of the truth. It had been a place of relentless motion, of arguments built and dismantled, of anxieties that paced the colonnades of his thoughts like caged animals. But now there was only this profound quiet. His mind felt as deep and as still as the night sky itself. the clamor of the agora replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to have its own resonant hum. The frantic need to know, to wrestle every mystery into the confines of a definition, to conquer uncertainty with the sharp blade of logic. It had all simply dissolved, like salt in water. In its place, something else had risen, a presence, quiet and luminous. It was not an idea, but a feeling, an embodied memory. It was the felt warmth of the afternoon sun as it had rested upon the silver-green leaves of the olive trees, the echo of the cricket's uncomplicated song, a declaration of being. That required no defense. The gnarled, patient resilience he had felt when he'd rested his hand upon the trunk of the oldest tree in the grove, its bark a map of centuries. Wisdom, he understood now with a certainty that had nothing to do with proof, was not a summit to be conquered at the end of a long and arduous climb. It was not a destination reached through the narrow, treacherous pass of dialectic. It was a home he had forgotten he possessed, and to which he had now, finally, returned. He had returned not through argument, but through the simple, unadorned act of seeing. He had sought truth in the abstract architecture of words, debated it into phantoms, written it into fragile scrolls. He saw now that it could not be captured there, any more than the scent of jasmine could be held in a closed fist. It was here, in the quiet warmth of connection he had felt with his student that afternoon, a shared silence that had said more than any dialogue they had ever exchanged. It was a philosophy to be lived, not lectured. He felt no urge to reach for a stylus, no need to scratch this revelation onto wax or parchment. To do so would be to cage it. His gaze drifted from the small, intimate flame of the lamp beside him, that captured mote of light, up to the scattered, silent fires of the heavens. He had always seen them as separate, as lamp and stars, near and far, comprehensible and infinite. But now, in the stillness, his vision softened. He saw them as one and the same, a single, eternal and gentle fire, manifest in 1,000 different forms. The philosopher's long journey, the restless search for a final, unassailable answer, had ended here, not with a victory or a new theorem, but with a quiet and profound acceptance. In the cool stone and the starlit water, in the scent of dust and the memory of a shared silence, he had come home to himself. And so, in the stillness of the Grecian night, the philosopher found not a new argument, but an old truth. He learned that the quietest heart hears the most. May you find your own quiet and listen well. Good night. What simple observation or quiet moment has brought you a sense of peace this week? We would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments.